Good evening. Did Arron Banks, who led the Leave.EU campaign, accept money as much as £8 million during the Brexit campaign from impermissible sources, that is, from overseas or foreign funding? Despite his insistence to the contrary, the National Crime Agency, which can operate across international borders, is investigating Arron Banks and his Leave.EU campaign's activity during the 2016 EU referendum. Mr. Banks and another senior campaign figure, Liz Bilney, were referred to the agency by the Electoral Commission. Mr. Banks appeared on the Marr Show on Sunday. To support his argument, he sent the BBC a number of documents which, he said, demonstrated there was no wrongdoing. John Sweeney has spent the last few days examining them.
Arron Banks, multi-millionaire insurance mogul and self-styled bad boy of Brexit, is being investigated over the exact source of £8 million worth of loans to Leave.EU. Mr. Banks has insisted that the money came from one of his British companies. But tonight, a Newsnight investigation reveals fresh leads pointing to offshore companies that may make his donations illegal. And we've seen invoices that suggest that Mr. Banks hit Leave.EU with some hefty markups. On Sunday, Mr. Banks went on the Andrew Marr Show to clear his name.
Well, I'd just like to say, absolutely, for the record, there was no Russian money and no interference of any type.
Say what you like about Arron Banks, he's been open and transparent about the source of the £8 million he loaned to Leave.EU. Or has he?
Rock Services is what we call a shell company. It doesn't do much of its own, does it?
Well, it's a service company, but it's a
but it's not a
UK-based
trading
service company.
It doesn't generate that kind of money.
I'm telling you that it came from insurance business written in the UK.
The critical issue is what precisely is the true source of the £8 million Arron Banks loaned to Leave.EU. The Electoral Commission has called in the police because it believes it's possible the money came from Rock Holdings, a Banks company based in the Isle of Man. If the cash came from the UK, that's a legal donation. Mr. Banks says that he can afford the £8 million because he's so rich. And this is the Bond villain's lair. Welcome to Catbrain Lane. This is the nerve centre of Mr. Banks's insurance empire. Its best-known brand, Go Skippy. You can tell it's high-end from the adverts. Mr. Banks points to an evaluation that he's worth £250 million. Others disagree. We asked accountant Ian Campbell, who's a Remainer, what he thought. Arron Banks goes on the Marr Show and says, this money came from Rock Services, and that's my business in the UK, Catbrain Lane, Bristol, therefore it's kosher. You've looked at the paperwork. Have you found proof of that?
No.
Have you found evidence of a loan from Rock Services to Leave.EU?
No.
Have you found in the other company party transactions money going from Rock Services to Leave.EU?
No. No, we haven't seen that.
Would you expect to?
You would, as Leave.EU should be listed within the connected counterparties, related parties of Rock Services, and therefore those should have been disclosed. Any amounts owing between the two entities should have been disclosed within the accounts.
I've decided today to donate £1 million.
Mr. Banks was absolutely clear on the Marr Show that the £8 million he says he loaned to Leave.EU came from Rock Services, based in Catbrain Lane, and therefore legal. To prove his innocence, Arron Banks handed over to the BBC bank statements from his Isle of Man company, Rock Holdings. His sidekick Andy Wigmore tweeted, "We have nothing to hide." But there's more in the Banks data dump, including this corker of an email sent, surprisingly, to the BBC. It reads, "Redact the reference for your all properties and any references which include sensitive information. For example, the account numbers that the money was sent from." Your all properties doesn't sound very British, and it isn't. There is a Ural Properties based in Gibraltar, which is where, it so happens, much of Mr. Banks' offshore empire is based. In the accounts of Ural Properties, we found a signature, Sally Davis. But Sally's email address is, according to the Gibraltar regulator, that of Louise Kentish. Sally Davis appears to be Louise Kentish, and she's the wife of Mr. Banks's former business associate in Gibraltar, Arron Kentish. Last year, Mr. Kentish was arrested over allegations of failure to disclose information. No charges have followed. We wrote to Louise Kentish, asking her whether she was the same person as Sally Davis, but she made no reply. Newsnight has had a good look at some of the invoices from Mr. Banks's businesses to Leave.EU.
What we see is that he marks up staff costs by between 50 and 75% when those are recharged to Leave.EU. Other costs are marked up at about 5%, and over those 3 months that generates about £285,000 in markup profits for Better for the Country at the expense of Leave.EU.
Who owns Better for the Country?
Better for the Country is owned by Arron Banks ultimately.
So what's happening here is that Arron Banks, entrepreneur, is stiffing Arron Banks, Leave campaigner.
It looks like an odd arrangement on its face. He's obviously adding a margin to costs that he is supposedly providing on a pro bono basis effectively to Leave.EU.
Team Banks have insisted they've been open and transparent, but as far as the stuff they've shown us, there's nothing there that proves where the money that went to Leave.EU actually came from. And then there's the question of Ural Properties. They went out of their way to redact references to that, and let's remember, it's a company with a Russian name based in a secrecy jurisdiction. Beyond that, as to the big question, where did this money come from? We still have no real idea.
John Sweeney, well, in a statement to Newsnight, Mr. Banks said, "No money came from the men with snow on their boots. The bank statements clearly show no large amounts of money came into Rock Holdings, and the main allegation that Russian money was the source of the campaign funding are false. There are no other bank accounts for Rock Holdings. The BBC have staff who can't get over the referendum result and for their own sanity need to start the mourning process." Well, joining us from Cardiff is the Labour MP